The normalcy bias, or normality bias, is a belief people enter when facing a disaster where they underestimate both the possibility of a disaster and its possible effects, even when we have incontrovertible evidence that it will happen, because it causes people to have a bias to believe that things will always function the way things normally function. This may result in situations where people fail to adequately prepare and, on a larger scale, the failure of government to include the populace in its disaster preparations. The assumption that is made in the case of the normalcy bias is that since one has never personally experienced a disaster, one never will. Normalcy bias has also been called analysis paralysis, incredulity response, the ostrich effect, and by first responders, the negative panic extent. About 70% of people reportedly display normalcy bias in disasters. The lack of preparation for disasters often leads to inadequate shelter, supplies, and evacuation plans. Even when all these things are in place, individuals with a normalcy bias often refuse to leave their homes. The normalcy bias creates a cognitive dissonance that they then must work to eliminate. Some manage to eliminate it by refusing to believe new warnings coming in and refusing to evacuate, maintaining the normalcy bias, while others eliminate the dissonance by escaping the danger. The normalcy bias may be caused in part by the way the brain processes new data. Research suggests that even when the brain is calm, it takes 8 to 10 seconds to process new information. Stress slows the process, and when the brain cannot find an acceptable response to a situation, it fixates on a single and sometimes default solution that may or may not be correct. An evolutionary reason for this response could be that paralysis gives an animal a better chance of surviving an attack, and predators are less likely to see prey that is not moving. Various sources have proffered more detailed advice for overcoming normalcy bias. First, be aware of your own normality bias and be conscious of the need to overcome it. Learn to think for yourself instead of relying on information from authorities or expecting help from the government. Challenge your own natural human tendency to avoid unpleasant news. As you go through your day, don't take for granted that everything will be as it always is. Be constantly aware of your surroundings so as to avoid being startled by the unexpected. Carry out thought experiments anticipating possible problems and getting mentally ready for them. What would you do if you were mugged? How would you handle a job loss? The more you practice this, the greater the likelihood you'll be able to choose between fight or flight rather than freezing up or surrendering. Develop survival plans, for example an evacuation plan in case of fire in your own home. The opposite of normalcy bias is overreaction bias, or worst-case scenario bias, in which small deviations from normality are dealt with as signaling an impending catastrophe. Noting the effect regression to the mean, most deviations from normalcy do not lead to catastrophe, despite regular predictions of doomsday. Logically, both underreaction, normalcy bias, and overreaction, worst-case thinking, are cognitive flaws and may extend to patterns of cognitive distortions.